Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Wisconsin Center for Wildlife's Spring Seminar Series. This series is titled The Art of Waterbird and Wetland Management, and this is a series that focuses not only on the management or the science side of wetland and waterfowl management, but also focuses on art and the intersection between art and wildlife science. We do have a special focus on the duck stamp and where the history of the duck stamp and where duck stamp funds are spent and how that benefits wildlife. But we also have some talks in this series that are about decoys and decoy carving and that art form. So as I mentioned, this is part of a full oops, there we go. Part of a full series. So this is the first talk in this series with Tim Eisele. And so if you are watching on YouTube, the rest of these recordings will be available. And so check out the playlist with the title of The Art of Waterbird and Wetland Management, and you can see all of these talks. I'd like to say thank you to the folks in the College of Natural Resources for helping to organize this. So this is Wisconsin Center for Wildlife is part of the College of Natural Resources, and we are using their YouTube channel for this, and they also help with promotions. The Wisconsin Center for Wildlife is part of a UW extension, or is part of extension, and so everything that we do is through the lens of extension and getting wildlife science out to the public. And I'd like to make a special thank you to Dr. Ben Settinger, who is our waterfowl specialist here on campus, and Dr. Marie Perkins, who is a bird specialist and a wildlife professor. They helped to organize this talk and bring together some different speakers and overall help to organize this whole seminar series. And finally, this is an important acknowledgement we go through anytime we have a public-facing event at UW-Stevens Point. So I'd like to say the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point exists upon land inhabited by the original indigenous peoples of this area, including the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and the many other nations and groups that predate colonial borders. We acknowledge that with colonization, Native American people have been dispossessed of their lands and irreparably changed by the actions of individuals and institutions. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to those actions. In partnership with the Native American Center, we commit to working together to honor the past, be intentional in the present, and to build our future with truth. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Tim Eisele. Tim Eisele is I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Sorry. Tim is a freelance outdoors writer and photographer. He is best known for some of his work in the Wisconsin Outdoor News, where he covers the Natural Resources Board and the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and their goings-on. And he also has written for other publications, including the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel and other major newspapers in Wisconsin. And I'd like to give this moment over to him to talk about Ding Darling and the federal duck stamp.
Thank you, Jennifer, very much. I really appreciate the invitation to be here and appreciate the College of Natural Resources and for putting on this series and allowing me to be here and talk about my friend Ding Darling. And there's a lot of people right now who I think don't know that Ding Darling really was a conservation hero in this country. He was an editorial cartoonist in Des Moines, Iowa. And basically his cartoons during the early 1900s spoke on behalf of wildlife and natural resources. And he was a really important voice for that. And the other thing, though, to me, he was a facilitator. He had ideas that he was able to get brought together and come out to fruition for important programs. And he put concepts and people together and basically to form programs that benefited wildlife and natural resources. So to me, he's a really big hero in this country, and I'm really pleased to talk about him here. So come along with me. Let's go ahead and we'll meet Ding Darling and my friend Ding and talk a little bit about the federal duck stamp program. Okay, so Ding Darling, and basically his full name really is J. Norwood Darling, and he was born in Norwood, Michigan in 1876. And so you have some idea of where he got his middle name. And then he passed away in 1962. And basically if you take a look at all of these years that he was alive and all of the events that took place, and basically from the 1800s to the 1960s, and changes in all of the modern concepts. Back during these years, he was doing editorial cartoons. There wasn't television, and there wasn't so much radio. And so what he was doing was an important voice for natural resources and wildlife back then. And why do I call him Ding? It's because of the way that he signed the cartoons for his last name. He abbreviated his last name, D''ing, for Darling. So that's why he's known as Ding Darling. And you'll notice that on some of the political cartoons that he did, he put a little X down at the end of his signature there. And basically he did that because he was from Des Moines, Iowa. And he got to know President Herbert Hoover and Mrs. Hoover very well. And he made a little pact with Mrs. Hoover that whenever he did an editorial cartoon and he did the whole thing all by himself, he would put that little X down at the end. He had a staff there at the Des Moines Register where he worked, which they had other cartoonists there who he would rough something out and then they would fill it all in. But when he did it all by himself, he put that little X down there. So that was his signature on the editorial cartoons that he did. This is some of the first work that we know about, some of the drawings. They lived in Michigan, and one time his parents received a postcard from some friends who were traveling over in England. It was called a Pat and Mike card, and it had sketches. And he saw that, and all of a sudden that intrigued him, and he started to get a pencil and paper and do some sketching. And here in the upper right, you can see a drawing he did of his mom and his dad and his older brother, Frank, and himself. And for any of you who are ruffed grouse hunters, you know that Michigan has got ruffed grouse. These are a couple of pretty realistic looking birds for ruffed grouse, if that's what he was modeling it after. So he started doing the sketching back then when he was in Michigan. And then later on, his dad was a minister, and they moved him to Sioux City, Iowa. So he grew up in Sioux City, Iowa, and that's where he really developed a real love for the outdoors. He did a lot of hunting and fishing there, went into the prairies in South Dakota and throughout western Iowa, and he did an awful lot of hunting, and that really developed his interest in the outdoors. And as he grew up, then he needed to go away to college. He chose Beloit College here in Wisconsin. So he was at Beloit College, and there he took quite a few courses in biology and zoology, but he was a very active person, very socially, and he happened to have a mandolin, and he entertained at a lot of parties, got involved in other activities. He was the editor of the school newspaper, and then he was the art director of the school yearbook. So that was good, except for in the very end of the school year, when all of a sudden the school yearbook came out. Here was a cartoon that he had drawn of the professors there at Beloit College, very distinguished conservative professors, dancing in tutus. And if you take a look at the faces on these people, you can see the beards, the glasses, the expressions on the faces. I think you'd be able to tell who's who, and they knew who was who. And that didn't go over very well. And especially right beside it, there was a cartoon showing the president of the university in kilts dancing the Highland Fling. So that really set it over the edge. And basically he got kicked out of Beloit College and had to go home. So he sat out for a year, but then he did come back to Beloit College and he graduated. And he said back then, he said, well, the real reason was that his grades weren't very good. He didn't spend a lot of time in class. But those cartoons really didn't help him at all. So he graduated from Beloit College, and then he needed a job. So he went back to Sioux City, Iowa, and he began there as a cub reporter from 1900 to 1906. And so he was writing articles for the newspaper back then. And he had done a little bit of sketching. He experimented. He had a camera, and he'd done some photography. One of the days, the editor had assigned him to cover a court case. And he went down to the court case, and he was sat in there, and he came back and wrote his article and turned it into the editor. But the editor said he knew that this one attorney was very agitated, and he asked him to go back and get a photograph of the attorney. So he took his camera back to the courtroom, went in to get a picture. The attorney saw him and chased him out of the courtroom. And so he went back to his office without the photo, but he sat down at his desk and he did a sketch. It was a sketch of the agitated attorney, and it ran with the article, and it became to be very helpful and a very popular. So all of a sudden, he started doing sketches, which was used in the Sioux City Journal, and they became very popular. They had to do with things going on around town. Here's one of the examples. This is one of his sketches that he did about Sioux City becoming baseball crazy. And it was inside and outside of the baseball grounds. You can see the people there, the guy pitching to somebody and the streetcar coming in with people. And they became very, very popular. So he made a name for himself as a cartoonist and a little bit as a writer. Well, his reputation grew. And all of a sudden, before you knew it, the Des Moines Register came calling, and they hired him. And he became the political cartoonist for the Des Moines Register from 1906 to 1911. Then he left for 2 years. He went out to New York, but that didn't work out very well for him. He really wanted to come back to Iowa. So from 1913 to 1949, he was the cartoonist for the Des Moines Register. And the interesting thing is that his cartoons ran on the front page of the Register, and they also ran on 100 other newspapers throughout the United States. And again, he's showing a lot about the problems that wildlife was facing and wildlife habitat. And he was really a voice for wildlife. And I want to show you a couple of these cartoons to give you an idea of what type of things he was doing. This is one of the first ones called The Outline of History. And if you look at that top panel up there, the couple are coming to the island, Utopia. Take a look at that. You've got coconuts lining the ground there. There's birds in the nest. There's fish jumping, and it's just trees, and it looks just wonderful, just wonderful. But then the next panel down, have you noticed how our population has increased? You've got kids over there robbing eggs out of the nest, throwing rocks at the birds, catching the fish. The trees look a little more dilapidated. The next panel down, elbow to elbow people, they're rioting, down with government. Somebody is saying that we're rabble-rousing about this and that, and they didn't like what was going on. And finally, the last panel down. There they are leaving with knapsacks. Let's go find Utopia. And the island is trashed. And basically, this is what he felt was the outline of history. And it sort of reminds me of a comment that Aldo Leopold made in a Sand County Almanac, that he said that the hardest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without destroying it. And I think this is the outline of history, and I think it was true. And what Ding Darling wanted to show, this is what happens, the way we treat land. This is the race with the stork in the world's rapidly increasing populations. You see the stork up above, flying off rapidly, dropping off all these newly born babies in parachutes. But down below, you've got the world's maximum food production trying to keep up in a horse and buggy. And it was a race. And it just wasn't keeping up with the stork. So he was concerned about population growth. And he often talked about his cartoons and said he liked to provide a little medicine, a little sugar coating, and as much humor as the subject will bear. This is one of his wildlife cartoons. And you see up above, wildlife on bended knee, saying, "Oh, Uncle John, please don't, please don't." Well, Uncle John is John W. Weeks, who's sitting there in the chair, and he's the secretary of the War Department. And back then, you didn't have a natural resources agency in the federal government. And the War Department was over the natural resources. And why are they pleading? What is their concern? You look down below at the next panel, and here you see these land developers down there, big, heavy people, holding plans to drain the lakes and sloughs to make more farmland. And he never did like the Army Corps of Engineers and people who were basically draining land and redirecting, channelizing rivers. And you see up there the steam shovel draining the pothole that was there, and there's fish belly up, and there's ducks trying to come in, and down below you see some of the birds, again with knapsacks, and there are tears coming out of their eyes, and basically they're leaving. And the question that Ding Darling asked down at the bottom is, why drain our lakes to make more farms when we're already suffering from overproduction of farm products? This ran in 1923. This is another really good one of wildlife, in that you've got a lot of these different organizations up above, each one trying to build a fire by themselves. You see wildlife conservation, forestry conservation, Save Our Songbirds, parks, sportsmen's leagues. They're all trying to build a fire. But look at down below, they're elbow to elbow. If you could ever get the firewood together in one pile, boy, she's a cooking now. One of the things that Ding Darling did is that he presented conservation dilemmas in common sense terms. He could take these things that were very complex and just put it together in one thing, which he did here. And what he was talking about here was trying to get people together. And as a result, with his efforts, was the formation of the National Wildlife Federation. And he became the first president of the National Wildlife Federation. There's three big ideas that he had that I'll mention here. And the first one was the National Wildlife Federation. He got people together to work on wildlife problems. This is another one that shows what changes one generation can make. This ran in 1928, Any Old Duck Marsh then and now. And if you take a look up above, you see here's this lone hunter or the marsh and decoys. And here, look at all these birds that are coming flocking in. And one of the things he did is that he showed movement really well. Take a look at those birds. Up until then, a lot of the artists had birds on the water and just sedentary. He showed movement in his drawings. And look at those birds. You can see some with their wings cupped and wings up, flocks in the sky, and there's skeins of flocks in the far distance. Any of us who have been out in the marsh on a November day and have seen birds flying out in the distance, migrating south, you know what that's like, and you can get the feeling of what that was like. But down below, he shows what happened later on. It's elbow to elbow hunters. The marsh has been drained, and you see that one duck in the upper right there trying to make it through a whole horde of duck hunters shooting up into the air at it. He was very concerned about what was happening. And one of the things, he returned to some of the different land that his uncle had owned many, many years ago, many years afterwards. And he returned to that land and he saw what had happened to it and how it had gone downhill. And he was just so frustrated with what happened to land and the wetlands. He was also concerned about sportsmanship. And here you have a Drake mallard that's looking in a dictionary, looking for the definition of a sportsman. He says, either this dictionary is wrong, or there are a lot of folks around here calling themselves by the wrong name. In the upper right, you see some of the violators up there, what he called bootleggers. They were shooting out of the season. They were killing wildlife all over, violating the laws and shooting when the seasons were supposed to be closed. Dead birds there left in the field, empty shotgun shells. He was really concerned about what was going on, and he didn't like it, and he called attention to those types of things. And either this dictionary is wrong, or there's a lot of folks around here calling themselves by the wrong name. They weren't sportsmen. This is one that some of the things that he did back then, it's sort of like the columnist, the comedian Will Rogers. They were true back then in the early 1900s. They're true today. This cartoon shows what mud in our rivers adds up to each year. And basically the equivalent of 125,000 160-acre farms now moving down our rivers. Take a look at all those parcels of farms that are in the middle there, all of the land that's moving down the river. You see the farming couple over there saying goodbye forever. All of that mud was moving down the river, and mud, and of course herbicides and pesticides later on going into the water and moving downhill. And now in 2022, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is larger than the states of Rhode Island and Delaware combined. And just in 2024, that dead zone was over 6,000 square miles. So that same problem was happening then, it's happening now. And he was drawing attention to the problem back then. Here's another good one where he blasts Iowa's governor and the state Republican political chairman for interfering with the Iowa State Conservation Commission. You see him trying to break into the safe there for the State Conservation Commission. And basically they were robbing some of the money, taking it from the Conservation Commission and putting it into other uses. He wanted conservation to be non-political, and he wanted people to be appointed to the various jobs and commissions to be people who were qualified, and not just appointees of politicians who happened to be their friends and had no background in natural resources. And he wanted to keep things non-political. And in fact, he helped form and serve on the Iowa Conservation Commission. This is nobody's constituents. And if you look up above, you see the USA there doling out bags of money to all these people getting in line. And there's transient aid and bankers aid and farmers aid and soldiers aid. Take a look at that mosquito there in the middle holding up a couple of bags of coins. You can almost see the smile on his face and his eyes brightening up there, walking away with it. But on the left-hand side, you've got wildlife, and they're in tattered clothing. Basically, they're saying, guess we'll have to go into politics. Nobody was speaking for them. They need to get people and politicians to talk on behalf of wildlife because nobody was doing that. Well, Darling did it through his cartoons, and you have to remember what was going on during this time of all of those cartoons. This was a time during market hunting. There was also very little enforcement of the few laws that were available to protect wildlife. The wetlands were disappearing. Somebody had said back then, we've got more duck hunters than we do have ducks. Wetlands were drying up. You had the drought, the depression, 1929 and the early 1930s. Waterfowl populations were just going downhill, and it was a really serious time. And I don't know if anybody recognizes that bird on the right, but that's Martha. She was the last passenger pigeon who died in the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914. And of course, passenger pigeons were wiped out wholesale. They just slaughtered them and sent them to market. So this is what was going on, was a big problem back then. They had to come up with something. They needed ideas to form something. What happened was that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt convened a committee called the Beck Committee. And on that were Aldo Leopold, who's shown here on the left, and Ding Darling, shown on the right, and then Thomas Beck, who the committee was named for. He was an editor of a magazine and also served on the Connecticut Fisheries Commission. So they put their heads together, and really, this is the one photo that we know of that Darling and Leopold are in the same photo. But the two of them were really concerned about habitat and realized you've got to get more habitat for wildlife. And they came up with ideas for refuges and more habitat, where some of the other people wanted to produce birds artificially and then stock them, but they put their effort into habitat. So what they did is that they knew that because farmers were plowing fence to fence, wetlands were disappearing and drought, the Dust Bowl, there just were very few ducks around. So they interviewed and they talked to different state conservation agencies and different groups to get what type of ideas they had. So there's a result of the committee were some of the first proposals to restore the duck nesting areas. And basically what they said, and they forwarded to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was that the federal government should purchase 12 million acres of poor farmland for refuges and wildlife habitat to increase populations of wildlife. And it's really interesting because to me, this sort of sounds a lot like what we have today from the Farm Bill that came up in 1985, because right there you're taking away erodible land, which isn't good for crops, putting it into habitat and trees and grasses that are good nesting cover for wildlife. So really what they were doing back then is sort of what we're doing right now with the emphasis on habitat. The problem was, how do you pay for buying land? They didn't have any money. There had been a suggestion previously by the American Game Protective Association, which proposed a stamp to fund land. And that association, I think later became Ducks Unlimited organization. But anyways, they had had a proposal about selling a stamp with the money to go into land purchasing. So they put all these ideas together and they forwarded on to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And then Ding returned to Des Moines, Iowa. He was glad to get out of Washington, D.C. Well, he no more than gets back to his desk at the newspaper, then he gets a call from President Roosevelt asking him, would you come out to Washington, D.C. and become chief of the U.S. Bureau of the Biological Survey? Well, Ding Darling was a very staunch Republican, and Roosevelt was a Democrat. And he wasn't so concerned he really wanted to do that. He wanted, is Roosevelt trying to do this to shut me up? Because then I can't do any cartoons about him. He finally decided that maybe I could have some input into things. Maybe I should do this. So he went to Washington, D.C., and basically on March the 10th of 1934, Ding Darling, shown here in the middle, was sworn in as the chief of the Bureau of the Biological Survey. On the left-hand side of the photo there is Henry Wallace. Henry A. Wallace was Secretary of the Department of Agriculture for Roosevelt, and he came from Iowa. He had also been Secretary of Agriculture in Iowa. So obviously he knew Ding Darling, knew of his interest in wildlife, had respect for him, and so he was sworn in as chief of the Biological Survey. And remember that date, March the 10th of 1934, because all of a sudden he's in Washington, and on March the 16th of 1934, Congress passes the Migratory Bill Stamp Act, which is then renamed to the Migratory Bird Hunting and Conservation Act. And what this requires is that hunters who are age 16 and over had to buy a federal duck stamp for $1. And that money was then going to go into a pot that was going to buy wildlife habitat and wetlands and also some refuges. So they had the law. And all of a sudden, Ding is at the Biological Survey. And during the summer, late summer, his staff in the education area came to him and said, we have to have a duck stamp. What's a duck stamp look like? We've never had a duck stamp. So Ding Darling took out some dry cleaning. He had some shirts that had been dry cleaned and they were in his office. And he took out the cardboard from those shirts and he started sketching. He sketched a pair of mallards that were coming in to a wetland and he forgot about it. Well, his staff took that to the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, and basically that was the very first federal duck stamp, sold for $1 in 1934, and the money was going to go into a fund to buy land and refuges. This is a photo that shows Darling at the post office buying that very first stamp. There's Postmaster William Mooney on the left behind him buying that very first stamp. So then he's at the Bureau of the Biological Survey. He was there for about 20 months, March of 34 to November of 1935. And what he did there was to set the Bureau really on solid ground. It was misorganized, and he really did a wonderful job out there. For waterfowl, he changed the season. He put in restrictions changed the duck season down to 30 days, took the duck daily bag limit from 15 down to 10. He emphasized law enforcement. He hired people to be professionals in law enforcement. Other professionals who had college degrees like J. Clark Salyer, Ira Gabrielson, put those people in charge of the different areas of the biological survey and really did a good job. In fact, he was so respected that they gave him that badge, and he was the first director of the biological survey to ever have a badge and wear it and have enforcement credentials. But he also then put the refuge system, there was a refuge here and a refuge there. Eventually, well, he took that and put it into a system so that it was organized and managed as a refuge system. He helped with some meetings, put together the American Wildlife Institute that I think became eventually right now the Wildlife Management Institute that's still in existence today. And he went to the different arms and ammunition manufacturers and he asked them for some donations, basically to help out the funding at the Bureau of the Biological Survey. And they did. They donated that as a donation, which is really interesting because this is from 34 to 35. And really in 1937 is when the Pittman-Robertson Act came in that has this 11% excise tax on arms and ammunition. So what he was doing was well before that. And it's in existence today, the Pittman-Robertson Fund, and really is beneficial from a lot of our wildlife management work. So anyways, these are his glasses that are on display at the National Conservation Training Center and the badge that he wore. He was really well respected, and he really did a wonderful job with the Bureau of the Biological Survey. One of the things he did there was to draw this goose, the Canada goose, and that is still used today. That is shown on signs on the boundaries of all of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife refuges, and he drew that goose. Well, one of the problems was that here they had this law, and they were going to start to sell stamps in the fall for $1, but they didn't have any money. And so he worked with Senator Norbeck from South Dakota. And Senator Norbeck got something inserted into a budget bill. He slipped it in there, got it passed by Congress, and then it went to President Roosevelt. And he had a bunch of bills to sign. And the story goes that he was leaving for a fishing vacation and asked his staff, well, what's in it? And well, they said, you know, there wasn't much in there. But Norbeck had slipped in that they were to get $6 million for this biological survey program for wildlife habitat. And he had signed it. And afterwards, Roosevelt realized what had happened. And he wrote this letter to J. Norwood Darling saying, here you got an appropriation through Congress, passed the budget, and signed by the president without anybody realizing that the Treasury had been raided. As ever yours, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt had promised him $1 million and never did come through with it. But with the help of Senator Norbeck, now he had $6 million, and that was the beginning to funding all of the land they were going to buy. Nowadays, if you ask about Ding Darling, most people will say, oh yeah, they've been to the Ding Darling Refuge. Well, that's located down at Sanibel Island in Florida. And Ding Darling and his wife Penny, who by the way attended the UW-Madison here, used to vacation down there, and they liked it so much. And then all of a sudden, some realtors were starting to buy land and develop it. And he was concerned what was going to happen to the wildlife. So Darling used his own money and bought some of that property. And then later on, he turned it over to the state, and they turned it over to the federal government. And that has become the Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. And that's right now down in Sanibel Island in Florida. And a lot of people visit that during the winter. So this is what I like to talk about Ding Darling and his legacy, because he was a voice for the nation's Wildlife and Natural Resources Foundation. One of the ideas he had was for the National Wildlife Federation, and that came true. A second idea was the Cooperative Wildlife Research Units to train professional employees. He came up with $3,000 of his own. He got $3,000 from Iowa State College And then another $3,000 from the Iowa Fish and Game Commission put that together to form the Cooperative Wildlife Research Unit in Iowa. It was the very first one. And now we've got cooperative wildlife research units all over the United States at land-grant universities. We have one right here in Madison. So they're training professional employees, and that's what he wanted, was professionals. So the National Wildlife Federation and cooperative wildlife research units are two of the really good ideas that he had, as well as the federal duck stamp. But he helped to form the Iowa chapter of the Isaac Walton League. He helped to form a non-political Iowa Fish and Game Commission, and he served on that commission for several years. He wanted to see science used. He didn't want to see things based on politics. So anyways, he retired. He retired finally. He returned to the Des Moines Tribune and retired in 1949, still drawing his editorial cartoons. And he passed away in February of 1962. But he's considered the father of the federal duck stamp, and I'd say he's the best friend that the ducks ever had. And he was so well thought of when he retired from the Biological Survey, the staff chipped in and they bought him this nice over and under shotgun, which is now housed at the National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And this is Dr. Mark Madison, who's the historian with the Fish and Wildlife Service. He's the only historian that the Fish and Wildlife Service has. And in fact, he's from Wisconsin. And he works out there, and they have all of the collection of the memorabilia of Ding Darling, that shotgun and the glasses and the badge that I showed you earlier. And you can see here in the background some of the wildlife that are confiscated by federal agents when people shoot things against the law, and they hold them there until they go to court. But all of the special things that the Fish and Wildlife Service has there are held there in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And this National Conservation Training Center is where a lot of people who are now employees of state conservation departments, or even some of the nonprofit organizations, go for training. And they've got 3 lodges out there. They've got the Rachel Carson Lodge, the Aldo Leopold Lodge, and they've got the Ding Darling Lodge. 3 of the luminaries of natural resources in this country are heroes out there by having the lodges named after them. So he passed away in 1962, and he drew this cartoon and he gave it to his secretary at the Des Moines Register. And he told her, though, don't use it till after I pass away. He'd been in ill health. And it says, bye now. It's been wonderful knowing you. Ding's farewell, that ran in the Des Moines Register February 13th of 1962. And if you look at that, you can see some of the movement. Look at the wind whipping up the papers from his desk there. You see the coattails as he's heading out the door and hat in hand. Look down below in the lower right, you can see his duck decoys and fishing rods with cobwebs on there. He had been ill, so he didn't get a chance to get out and do much hunting or fishing. Up above that chair there, the couch, you can see that goose that he drew, which is the symbol now along the edge of all the national wildlife refuges. To the left of the door, you see Farmer John when he drew editorial cartoons about big agriculture in Iowa. And often he would use Farmer John to say different things. Upper left was Teddy Roosevelt. He was one of his heroes. And when Teddy Roosevelt died in 1919, he did that editorial cartoon showing his ghost, the Rough Rider, riding off into the sky, waving goodbye with his hat. And down below it, you can see the ducks cupping in. That very first duck stamp, those 2 mallards cupping in, and that was the federal duck stamp that he drew. So that was really a culmination of a lot of the different editorial cartoons, some of the really big ones that he did in that final cartoon, and he passed away in 1962. The father of the migratory bird hunting and conservation stamp, the duck stamp, and this shows you some of those stamps now after that very first one. You can see where those first stamps are all one color, and it's changed in that now it's in 4 colors. But it's required of all waterfowl hunters age 16 and over. And it's just a wonderful program. It's the one federal program that has done exactly what it should do, and that's to raise money for wildlife habitat. And basically what they did is that they chose an artist to paint a picture. And from 1943 to 1949, they had an artist draw the picture that was then the duck stamp. But then it got to be a big thing, and they realized a lot of artists wanted to compete for that, wanted to do that. So they started art competition in 1949, and they had 3 people come in and serve as judges. And they opened it up, and the artists could submit their entries, draw their paintings, submit their entries, and then the judges would come to Washington, D.C. and take a look at the paintings, and basically then they would select a winner, and that would appear on the federal duck stamp. So in 1994, the chief of the Fish and Wildlife Service asked me if I would like to be a judge in the federal duck stamp contest, and I would love it. It was a lifetime ambition for me. I was an avid hunter. I collected duck stamps. I wrote about the duck stamp. And so it was really a wonderful experience, and it was a chance for me to participate in that program. So I went to Washington, D.C. I strolled by the White House. Bill and Hillary were in the White House back then, but they didn't invite me in for coffee. So I kept going to the Department of the Interior building, and that's where it was held in 1994 for 3 days, the end of October to early November. The contest was held down in the auditorium of the Department of the Interior building. And one of the things I learned back then was a little bit about the duck stamp, that really the artist doesn't receive anything other than a sheet of stamps from his or her painting. But then, of course, what they can do is that they can sell limited edition prints. But the Fish and Wildlife Service in the duck stamp office has the rights to then sell that image, to license it to different products. Manufacturers who you can see here make shirts, t-shirts, different shirts. There's coffee mugs, mouse pads for computers, hats, ties, and all of these different products. And then they receive proceeds from that. So again, that money, plus the sale of the duck stamps, goes into the fund to buy wildlife refuges and wildlife habitat. And this is Anita Nagara, who then back then in 1994 was in charge of licensing and marketing for the duck stamp office. This was a poster that they had that showed from the very first duck stamp in 1934 up until that time, shows all of the different federal duck stamps that were selected, and collectors would buy that, as well as of course, collectors collect the stamps. This shows you we had 5 judges back then. There's 2 people here that are not judges, and on the far right is Bob Lucino. Bob was chief of the federal duck stamp office, and he ran a really great program, and I had very high respect for Bob. Third from the left in the back is Robert Smith. Bob Smith was with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he just happened to be in the room at the time that photo was taken. But the 5 judges then are up in front. And you see first on the right there is Gene Garriman. Gene was from New Jersey. He collected duck stamp art. He was a member of the New York Stock Exchange, and he had several originals that had been selected for duck stamps, and he collected that and prints for duck stamp art. So he was an art collector. Mark LaBarbera was the executive director of the North American Hunting Club up in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, and so he was very involved in hunting. And he also then he moved back to Wisconsin, and for a couple of years he was the executive director of the Wisconsin Wildlife Federation and still lives in Wisconsin. Myself, I was an avid waterfowl hunter. I collected duck stamps. I wrote about the duck stamp. And in graduate school at University of Madison, I had done my master's thesis on Wisconsin waterfowl hunter attitudes and regulations and management policies. So I was very involved in waterfowl hunters and hunting. In the red is Geneva Bitberry. Geneva was really a neat gal from Louisiana, and she was an ornithologist. She had a life list of birds that was just as long as your arm, and she was an awful lot of fun, and she was a neat person. And then on the far left is Dave Butts, and Dave was he was a football player with the Washington. He was a lineman back then with the Washington Redskins, and he had played in 3 Super Bowls, but he also hosted an outdoor TV show. I think it was in Ohio, and collected duck decoys. So it was really interesting. So he had this background, he had a mix of backgrounds in art, in hunting, in birding, in collectibles. So it was a good various background that we had to do our judging. And every place that we went, people wanted to see those Super Bowl rings that Dave Butts had on big chunks of metal and diamonds on his hands, and they were really neat to see. That was a lot of fun. So basically, that year, there were 585 originals that were submitted in the duck stamp contest. So they were all on display here in the auditorium of the Department of Interior. So we had a chance, and that was our job, was to look at all of those entries. And we met informally the night beforehand just to go over the rules and find out the procedures. And also we had as a couple of people for our technical questions that we had. One was the biologist, David Kathamer from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If we had questions about the anatomy of a bird, the coloring, the habitat, David was really our source for questions and we could go to. Then there was Leonard Buckley, who was with the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, because this original, which is 7 by 10 inches in size, has to be reduced to a little 1 and 2 inch stamp. So he had to consider how this was going to look as a stamp and take that into consideration. And in the middle of that photo, there's in the dark suit turned away from us is Norma Upgrand. She was a past chief of the Federal Duck Stamp contest, and she had joined us that night for the briefing. So we learned a lot more about the program and what was going to take place. Each year in the contest, there are 5 species that are eligible to be submitted in that year's contest. The year that I judged, it was the Canada goose, mallard, green-winged teal, the greater scaup, and then the pintail. So all the artists had to do a painting on one of those 5 species. So this is an example of the originals. They're 10 inches by 7 inches in size, and there's no names on there. So the judges have no idea who's painted what. And you can see here a variety. You see Canada geese, you can see green-winged teal, mallards. In the middle there on the bottom row, you see a pair of mallards paddling by on water, and there's a waterfall coming over it. So the artists are showing what they want to show to try and get the judges to like what they've made. And here you see they're looking at the green-winged teal. The question could be, well, how do you judge a painting? Well, number one, it's on anatomical accuracy. Is the bird anatomically correct? Number 2, habitat. Is that correct? For instance, you wouldn't find a canvasback sitting on a branch of an oak tree, but you might find a wood duck there, but not a canvasback. So the habitat that it's in, then again, how it's going to be reduced to 1 inch by 2 inches in size. And then at the very end, the judge's decision on just composition and what's the effect on you. How do I like this? What does it do for me? So that's how we judged. And in this case, the judge here had a question about the speculum on that green-winged teal. You can see David Kathamer had a book there showing all the speculums of the different waterfowl, so that we could ask about that, and are these feathers correct, and is the coloring correct, and find out from him. He was really our expert. Here was another one where another judge had a question about the Canada goose down below. If you take a look at that Canada goose, if you were to see it up close, you'd see it has a flat head. And one of the questions was, well, can Canada geese, can they have flat heads? We learned that yes, it is possible to have a flat head. And so they're not all rounded. So that was a question that one of the judges had, and we learned about that. But that was that was an interesting painting. So then we had to look, we had a chance to look through reduction glasses, basically looking through those to see how it would look again as a 1 by 2 inch stamp. So here you see 2 of the judges taking a look at the originals with the reduction glasses. Here's just another close-up showing some of the art that was there, and some was sort of basic, but there was a lot that was really, really good. If you take a look at the greater scope down in the lower left, see it's swimming, diving down into the water. You see bubbles there, and there's some minnows around it. One of the probably the only one that was I've ever seen that was a duck underwater. But again, you see pintails, you see mallards, green-winged teal. We had to judge from all of these paintings. And here again, here's that another better view of the Canada goose. There you see some more Canada geese, green-winged teal. So we had to narrow it down. That was our job. And one of the people who was there was the Neil Anderson. They invite back the artist who basically painted the duck stamp painting from the previous year. So Neil and his wife Susan were there, and Neil had painted the duck stamp the year beforehand. And I'd asked him, I said, well, I've heard, that you artists become millionaires after you win that. Oh, no, that's not true. Basically what they do is that they can then have prints made, limited edition prints that they sign, and they get money off of that. And of course, their reputation goes up. If you're the winner of the duck stamp contest, that's really great. So there was really a neat couple and really nice person. But basically, I learned that basically they make their money through the art prints. And this was on display the year that we judged. It's the very first duck stamp ever sold. It was owned by Jeanette Rudy. She was the sister of Bitt Berry, who was one of our judges. So she brought this, and that was that very first stamp that you see that was signed by Ding Darling. You saw the picture earlier. And that first year they sold 635,000 of those stamps. That stamp, Jeanette Rudy bought that, and I think for a couple $100,000, and that's now housed in a bank vault somewheres. But that was on display there, and that was really very interesting to see that. So they started the contest. They had Sean Mann, who was a champion duck and goose caller from Maryland, and he blew the calls from each of the ducks that were in the contest, and then the Canada goose. So then the judges were all up on the stage in the auditorium. We were up there facing out to the audience, and we were separated from each of the other judges. You see there some poster board that was up, and so we had no idea any reaction from the other judges. And they had a lawyer from the U.S. Solicitor's Office who would then bring the original to each of us. We had a chance to look at it until we were satisfied, and then the lawyer would move on to the next person. So show it to each person up close, and then we would vote, and we voted it either in or out. And you can see here, all 5 voted the painting that was shown at that point out. And again, we had no idea what the other judges were doing. But here it was pretty unanimous. All 5 were out. So from 585, after a day and a half, we selected 24 that we thought were the top ones. We could bring back, each judge could bring back, I think, 5. And in total, there were 5 that were brought back for additional reconsideration. So now in the second afternoon, then we were going through 29 entries. And take a look now, because you're going to be able to judge these here. You'll see there's 3 mallards there, flying mallards up above, 2 flying mallards down below, cupping into a wetland. And you see green-winged teal on the left and pintails on the right, and a pair of mallards on the ice down there. We had a chance again to go back, take a look at all the art that was there, take a look ourselves. Then we had to judge them, and we had to rate them from 1 to 5. And basically, we put up the sign there with the number that we felt. And you can see there that there's one person with a 1, and there's somebody on the left with a 5. So then 3 3s. So, they're pretty consistent there amongst the other judges. And it was sort of funny because at one time we raised up the numbers, and there was a woman who was in the audience who had brought a baby in there, and the baby started crying. And Dave Butts looked up and said, "Oh, is that one of the artists?" And it was sort of funny because we didn't know it, but there were artists in the audience, and they were there and they were watching. And that's one of the best ways that artists have to know what they're up against as far as quality competition and what the judges think about it. So we had we went it down from those 29, and basically we narrowed it down then to 11 paintings. So these are the 11 paintings that survived into the third and final round. And again, you can see there's a couple of pintails in the upper left, and in the middle down there, you see a gorgeous drake pintail on ice, a couple of pintails on water. Upper right, again, those flying mallards. The lower left, the flying mallards coming into a wetland. And on the right, a Canada goose with a flat head. These are in that final 11. What's your choice? And off to the right here, a couple of them I didn't get. There's a pintail standing and mallards and Canada geese on ice. Mallards flying that you've seen before, and that Canada goose with the flat head. So on the last day, we could tell the auditorium just filled up. There was a lot of buzzing. There's a lot of murmuring. People came in, flooded into the auditorium. And on that last day, there was one painting that each of the judges held up a perfect 5. And I could hear an ooh go through the auditorium. And I wondered, I was holding up a 5, but I had no idea what the other ones did. You know, maybe I had a 5 and they had 1s. I had no idea. But this is the first time in the federal duck stamp competition that an entry got a perfect 5. And basically then, Molly Beatty, who was the chief of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, came in and she held up the winning entry. And Molly was a really interesting person, neat gal. And unfortunately, she passed away just a couple of years later from cancer, but she was a really neat individual. And that winning entry were the flying mallards. And these mallards were painted by a young artist from Minnesota who happened to be in the audience, and I didn't know that. Jim Hottman, he was the first place winner. And Jim came from Chaska, Minnesota, and I had a chance to meet him and interview him. And it was really interesting because he had painted those mallards from an experience out hunting with his dad and his brothers. But the interesting other thing is that here, number 2 was Bob Hottman, his brother, that Canada goose with the flat head. So the Hottman brothers came in number 1 and number 2. And David Moss with the 2 of those mallards that were flying into a wetland was number 3. But I want you to take a look at that Canada goose. Look at the perspective. From down below, you're looking up. There's nothing but sky up above it, and there's grass down below it. Well, each year when one of the paintings is selected, that bird is removed, and then a new bird is moved in. So the next year, 5 birds, 4 are still remaining, and 1 new are eligible to be selected by 5 different judges. So if you take a look at that Canada goose, and 2 years later, this is what won. Bob Hottman won with that Canada goose, and look what he did. He changed the perspective, and you've got water in the background, you've got the marsh, and so it just changed it entirely. But 5 different judges picked that painting to be the winner that year. So it tells me something about good art, 5 different judges. And the interesting thing is that here, Jim and Bob and Joe Hottman, who all were in the audience when I was there, have won 14 federal duck stamps, the most. It's just an unbelievable family tradition and being noteworthy that they've done that. So that was 2 years later. Well, what Wisconsin artists have been in the federal duck stamp competition and won? So this was Owen Grummey in 1945. And this, of course, was when the Biological Survey had selected the artist. So they selected him to do that. So it wasn't until later on then when they actually had the judging. Martin Merck from Eagle painted these Ross's geese in 1977. And finally, Arthur Anderson, so far, in 1987, he painted these redhead ducks. And Arthur was from Alaska. So those are the 3 artists, and I had a chance to call and interview each of them. And Arthur Anderson made the comment to me that it was a simple design that was the key, powerful lighting. But he said to me, he said, you know, after you make it past the first round, anything, then because that's a crapshoot. And after that, you're up against the best of the best. So the main thing is getting through that first round. Neil Anderson had talked about good composition and reliable reference material. He had talked about painting a bill on a duck that wasn't quite right, and he had to redo that. And Jim Hottman had said, you've got to get out and see the birds. And he told me that, those two mallards that he had painted were basically from a hunting experience with his dad and brothers. And that's what he was painting from. Well, then we went home, and then we came back to Washington, D.C. the following year in June. And back then we got to judge again, but this time it was the federal junior duck stamp, and we learned about that. The federal junior duck stamp is eligible to any students from kindergarten through 12th grade. They can enter it with their paintings. And this is something that people need to be aware of. And I encourage you to, if you've got youngsters or have nephews or cousins that are in school, talk to them, get them interested in this, and get teachers to host this in the schools. Back then, the winner from the previous year was Clark Weaver from Pennsylvania. He painted the 94-95 federal junior duck stamp, those hooded mergansers in the upper right. And so these were some of the paintings that students had drawn that we were judging. And it came down to, it was a much briefer experience, just an hour or two here. We're using poker chips to put them on those that we felt were the good ones. And finally it came down to a tie, and Dave Butts had the job of breaking up that tie, and this was the winner. It was a young artist from Montana with the pintail. This was the entry that year from Wisconsin. Perry Hochstetter from Webster, Wisconsin had painted the wood ducks. And a couple years later, this young lady, Carissa Nelson, had actually been the national winner for the junior duck stamp for 2005, 2006. She was from Grantsburg. And I found that a lot of the teachers in the schools up in northwestern Wisconsin encourage their students to participate in that. So it's really neat. And it's something that really more and more students should do. So back then, it was the first day of issue ceremonies, and they had a pane of the very first stamps to come off that Jim Hottman had painted. So here the artist got to sign those. Some of the officials with the Fish and Wildlife Service got to sign them. The judges got to sign them. That's the only thing my son Sean ever said, hey, Dad, I'm impressed, because that sheet of stamps is supposed to be housed in the Smithsonian Institution. They have all of the stamps there on display and housed there with the signatures. This is what a sheet of stamps looks like from all of the coming off of the printing presses. And then, of course, they had the programs from that first day of issue ceremonies. So a lot of collectors came by and had the judges sign the programs, and then also stamps, and of course the artists. So here Jim is signing the stamps themselves. So you know at this point how the federal duck stamp came about, Ding Darling, and what he did in putting together that very first duck stamp. And you know how the duck stamp is judged, how the artists submit their work, and the judges come together and they look and they pick a duck stamp. But this is where the rubber meets the road. Over all those years from 1934, it's been over $1 billion that's been generated as of now, and over 6 million acres have been purchased or leased for federal refuges or waterfowl production areas and habitat in wetlands. This is really what's important. It's been the one program that has done exactly what it was supposed to do. Here in Wisconsin, since 1934, we've sold more than 7 million duck stamps. And Horicon, Necedah, and Trempealeau National Wildlife Refuges have been bought in part with duck stamp revenues. In fact, 99% of Horicon was purchased with migratory bird conservation funds, which come from the stamps. And the waterfowl production areas in the Leopold and St. Croix wetland management districts in Wisconsin, the Northwest and South Central Wisconsin, are purchased with duck stamp money. Here's a depiction of where those WPAs are located. You see South Central Wisconsin, Northwest Wisconsin, then all throughout Iowa, Minnesota, and the Prairie Pothole area in the Dakotas into Montana. that's where the WPAs are located. And they all have signs depicting the production areas that they're open to public hunting, but they're also used by non-game animals. And so herons and egrets and pheasants and all sorts of wildlife can use that for nesting and cover. So it's really good habitat that's now provided through the duck stamp. This shows you some of the federal refuges throughout the United States that have been purchased with duck stamp funds. When my wife and I, Linda, when we travel and we go to many different federal refuges, we like to stop and see them. This is Chincoteague out in the Delmarva Peninsula out east, the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico, Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. I wanted to go down and see the whooping cranes down there, and we did. We saw them. And these are whooping cranes at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge in Wisconsin, and that's not a painting, that's an original photo that I took of, and the bird on the left is the first bird to have been hatched in the wild in Wisconsin, maybe since the 1800s, and that was a pair of whooping cranes at Necedah National Wildlife Refuge. And of course, here we are on the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife Refuge. I do a lot of duck hunting over there, and these are canvasbacks along the Upper Mississippi. And that came about because of Will Dilg, who was a writer from Illinois who was very active in the Isaac Walton League, got it formed, and basically got the Upper Mississippi River National Wildlife and Fish Refuge formed. And really, that person was behind it. So look at what he's done, what Ding Darling did. So amazing. These are some of the stamps in my collection. I had Owen Grummey sign the one up above on the left, and Jim Hautman signed the one on the right. And the one down below, I bought from an employee, a friend that I had back at the old Wisconsin Conservation Department. Ernest Swift signed that. He was then chief secretary of the Wisconsin Conservation Department, went on to be the head of the National Wildlife Federation out east. And now the duck stamp is also printed in a new format. And you can see it fits basically in a cash register. So it's much easier for places like sporting goods shops to sell that. They could keep it in their cash register, and the stamp is right in there. It can be peeled off or it can be kept right on there. And in 2025, this year now, the 5 different species that will be eligible are the wood duck, the gadwall, cinnamon teal, bufflehead, ruddy duck. So anybody who's going to compete in that, they have from June 1st to August 15th of 2025 to send in their painting along with $125 to the duck stamp office in Maryland, and then they will compete and it'll be judged. And basically, this is so interesting that the federal duck stamp has been won by Jim the 6th time, and on this stamp that's showing up here with the redheads, and he's won the most of anybody. And it's a new record that Jim, Bob, and Joe have won the 14 duck stamps. And I think it's sort of funny, if any of you are interested or fans of the movie Fargo, that then the deputy sheriff is going out to chase a criminal, and she asks her husband, who's going to be staying at home, "What are you going to do today?" He says, "Oh, yeah, I was going to paint my entry in the federal duck stamp contest, but I don't know if it does any good because the Hautmans always win." So look for that if you happen to see the movie Fargo. It's a really neat mention of the duck stamp. So you take a look at some of these different stamps. They're miniature works of art. Basically, it's a license. In a way, it's a federal hunting license because you have to have it to hunt migratory waterfowl. It's a conservation tool. It raises money that goes into habitat, and some wildlife refuges require you have that to enter the refuge. But it can be purchased by anybody and by birders, photographers. And this is something a lot of people don't realize, that anybody can buy it, not just hunters. And the proceeds go into the Migratory Bird Conservation Fund. And back in 2023, they passed the Modernization Act, which now allows hunters, if you're going to be, say it's at night and you're going to go hunting the next day and you don't have a duck stamp, you can go online, you can buy that duck stamp, you get an authorization, but then they will mail you the physical duck stamp the following year after March. So, but it's interesting. But one of the parts of that is that they kept, we want to keep that federal duck stamp printed. So not just the authorization. Some states are doing away with stamps and just giving people authorizations with their licenses. But we want to be sure that stamp is still printed and is a part of the program. We have an organization called the Friends of the Migratory Bird Duck Stamp, and basically they encourage all our members to not only buy a stamp, but buy two. So I buy 2 duck stamps every year. So I'd encourage you to join that, buy 2 duck stamps. And now with things that are going on in Washington, D.C., they're downsizing the federal agencies. It's so important to keep an eye on what's going on. Basically, we want to keep that federal duck stamp office open. It's down to 1 employee. We want to keep that going. We want to keep the federal duck stamp contest going because the funds that it generates are so important for wildlife. And anybody who wants to learn any more, I would encourage you, this duck stamp story by Eric Dolan is so good. The Wild Duck Chase by Martin Smith. Ding Darling book by David Lent is a great biography on Darling. And America's Darling is a DVD by Sam Kultinsky. And that's really interesting. Talks all about some of the other artistic things that he's done. But again, Jade Norwood Darling, his cartoons appeared on 150 major daily papers. He won 2 Pulitzer prizes. They weren't wildlife ones, but 2 Pulitzers. But he had the 3 ideas of the federal duck stamp that he pushed along, the National Wildlife Federation, and basically the cooperative wildlife research units. And I'd say he was the best friend the ducks ever had. And I'm just going to leave you with 3 of his cartoons here that I think were some of the best. If you take a look at this, you've got a steam shovel up above digging out all of the Earth's resources. Look at that hole in the earth up above, the rendering plants spitting out the waste, generating money down below, down into the coffers. And he's asking, how rich will we be when we've converted all of our forests, all of our soil, all of our water resources, and our minerals into cash? How rich will we be? I think that was true then. It's true today. This one talks about Mother Nature. She spent 1 million years putting up preserves for us. The shelves are covered up there. But now look at them down below. The shelves are bare. And then finally, down below, the world spends the rest of history fighting for what's left of sustaining resources. You know, we've heard about wars over oil, wars over water. It's true what's happening to our natural resources. And last, one of his favorite editorial cartoons, as land goes, so goes man. But down below, he says, but just try to get any politician to do anything about it. He was a voice for wildlife. So it's really been a pleasure talking to you about Ding Darling. I will borrow Ding's words and bye now, saying it's been nice, wonderful knowing you. And I want to give thanks to some of the people who helped me with information. Kip Koss, who was the grandson of Ding Darling, gave me permission to use his cartoons and talk to me about it. The Ding Darling Foundation, Dr. Mark Madison at the Conservation Training Center, Willamette College Archives, Iowa State University Press, David Lent's book on Ding Darling, and Eric Dolan book has to do with natural resources. And I just say that if anybody has questions, please feel free to reach out to me at timeiseley@gmail.com. And with that, bye now. It's been wonderful knowing you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. This was a real pleasure. Thank you for this excellent presentation. And again, Tim's contact information is there if you'd like to reach him. And we'd like to thank you all for watching.